Look to the south, and you who went with me through the land can best say if they too have not been fearfully punished. Mourning in every household, desolation written in broad characters across the whole face of their country, cities in ashes and fields laid waste, their commerce gone, their system of labor annihilated and destroyed. Ruin, poverty, and stack of miseries. William Tecumseh Sherman.
When Lee finally surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, the war between the states had lasted more than 4 years and cost $20 billion. 1 million men had been killed or wounded. The South lay in ruins. Driven by hunger and starvation, people wandered the countryside in search of jobs that didn't exist. Now a new challenge faced the nation: how to restore the southern states to the Union. Who would decide the terms under which they would be readmitted? Should the former rebels be forgiven or punished? And what should be the fate of the freedmen, the close to 3.5 million African American men, women, and children released from bondage? There was no blueprint to follow. No agreement about who could or should make these decisions. Reconstruction of the American South would last for more than a decade. An era of grand visions and failed experiments, it would witness enormous economic and political changes, add 3 new amendments to the Constitution, and shape American race relations for a century to come. It would also become a subject of tremendous controversy from that day to this. By 1863, much blood had already been spilt in the farmlands and small towns throughout the land. Congress had also become a battlefield, with congressmen fighting over how to put the nation back together, while their relatives slaughtered each other in an escalating civil war. President Lincoln tried to stop the fighting by offering the South a compromise. He proposed that only 10% of Southern voters need petition for readmittance to the Union to be welcomed back. Too lenient, said Congress, which insisted on stricter terms.
The federal government should revolutionize Southern institutions, habits, and manners. The foundations of their institutions must be broken up and relaid, or all our blood and treasure will have been spent in vain. Thaddeus Stevens, Pennsylvania Congressman.
We will never know if Lincoln could have worked with Congress on a unified policy for Reconstruction of the Southern states. On April 14, 1865, John Wilkes Booth, an unstable actor sympathetic to the Confederate cause, assassinated Lincoln at Ford Theater in Washington, D.C. Millions mourned as a funeral train carried the martyred president's body back to Illinois. With Lincoln's tragic death, the fate of the former Confederate states fell into the hands of new President Andrew Johnson from Tennessee, who had 8 months to bring about readmittance of the Southern states before Congress reconvened. Back in 1861, Andy Johnson had been the only Southern member of Congress to oppose secession. Once a poor tailor, Johnson had hated the old slave aristocracy of the South. But the president was quick to pardon prominent Confederates and return their property. Within a few months, the former Confederate states had ratified the 13th Amendment and met enough of Johnson's terms to rejoin the Union and to send their newly elected representatives to the new 39th Congress. And then all hell broke loose. The South had elected 4 Confederate generals, 58 members of the Confederate Congress, 6 of Jefferson Davis's cabinet officers, and Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens, all former secessionists, unrepentant and unreconstructed. What's more, the new Southern legislatures had passed laws called black codes, which came close to recreating slavery in all but name.
Northern Republican legislators were very displeased by what had happened. And that was understandable when you think about it, simply because they had been engaged in a war for 4 years in which hundreds of thousands of lives had been lost, merely to turn around now to see the people who had been responsible return to power. And so the Republican-controlled Congress refused to seat such persons, immediately created a joint committee on Reconstruction to investigate the situation in the South, to embark upon a new policy that would begin to create some guarantees that the former slave population would at least be granted at least some minimal rights so that their newly won freedom would have some actual substance.
Claiming that this was the work of radicals out to destroy the Union, Johnson vetoed the legislation, and the battle was on. The heart of the Congress's plan was a new 14th Amendment to the Constitution.
The 14th Amendment is one of the most complex amendments in the U.S. Constitution. It was a grab bag amendment that was an attempt by Northerners, by Republicans, to solve all the constitutional and political problems they were having with Reconstruction in one shot.
So it was to establish citizenship rights for the former slaves and for free blacks that had been living here for years. It was to give legal equality to all of these persons, but also to give due process rights and equal treatment before the law to anyone, even if they weren't a citizen. And so the 14th Amendment proves to be a very important amendment to the Constitution.
In the future, this amendment, popularly known as the Equal Rights Amendment, would become one of the most important, protecting the rights not only of African Americans, but also of women, the elderly, people with disabilities, and others. But at the time it was proposed, the 14th Amendment was a blow to two of the most sacred principles of Southern politics, states' rights and the belief in Negro inferiority.
Equality does not exist between whites and blacks. The one race is by nature inferior in many respects, physically and mentally, to the other. Alexander Stephens.
The Southern states that had been in the Confederacy did not like this one bit, because they did not want their former slaves to have political power.
The Southern states rejected the amendment. Rallying to their cause, President Johnson hit the campaign trail, haranguing voters to throw the Republicans out of office. But the voters sided with the Republicans, not Johnson.
Back in Congress, they passed the Reconstruction Act of 1867, which reimposed military law, dividing the South into 5 military districts. Readmittance to the Union now would require ratification of the 14th Amendment, black political participation in the elections for state constitutional conventions that would then set up new state governments, and congressional approval of their new state constitutions. Radical Reconstruction had begun.
Johnson and Congress were in a street fight, going at each other tooth and nail. When the president dismissed Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton against Congress's wishes, the House of Representatives, in a move unprecedented in American history, initiated impeachment proceedings against the President of the United States for high crimes and misdemeanors.
The Senate trial dragged on for 11 weeks. When it was over, Johnson had escaped conviction by only a single vote. That November, the American people elected war hero Ulysses S. Grant as the 18th President of the United States. Black voters helped put Grant over the top.
The Republicans didn't have enough white support in the South to build Republican parties. So they looked to black votes to build Republican parties so that the Democratic Party wouldn't take over. And what they needed to do was to protect black ballots, and the best way to protect black ballots was through a constitutional amendment.
To make sure that Southern whites didn't take the vote away from black men, the Republicans wrote a 15th Amendment for the Constitution, which forbade states to deny the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous servitude.
It allowed African Americans to participate in American society on an equal basis for the first time. And this was radical to many whites because the thought was, hey, these people are not equal to us.
It did something else. It also clearly did not include women. And women were angry with the 15th Amendment.
I will cut off this right arm of mine before I will ever work for or demand a ballot for the Negro and not the woman. Susan B. Anthony.
Female abolitionists felt the time had come for their rights to be recognized too.
Women had been one of the two pillars of the anti-slavery movement from the 1830s on. They had helped in reform movements, they had helped win the war, and the choice was made by Republicans, saying that black suffrage was enough to make many white voters angry. Women's suffrage added on to that would be too much, and both would lose. So we're going to have to choose which one we want. In the short run, they thought it more important that blacks be protected than that women be protected in the ballot.
In 1869, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton formed the National Women's Suffrage Association to get a 16th Amendment to the Constitution that would guarantee women the right to vote. But Reconstruction's focus would remain on race, not gender, and the major battlegrounds remained in the South, where more than 90% of all African Americans still lived.